We can take a little sketch of it.
I think these are all excellent. That's my mom.
Yeah, it's very good.
I appreciate it even more.
Are you ready to go?
Good evening, everyone. My name is John Taves, and I'm the event coordinator here at McNally Robinson Booksellers. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that McNally Robinson is located here on Treaty 1 territory. That's the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, in the homeland of the Métis Nation. In addition, McNally Robinson Booksellers itself rests on the land once occupied by the Métis community, Brewstertown. We're delighted you could join us here tonight for the Winnipeg launch, Sweet as Sugar and Other Stories by Camille Hernández-Ramdwar. We're very grateful to Rare Machines and Dundurn Press for helping to pull this evening together and for publishing this book, as well as that of our host this evening, Rowan McCandless, who published the exceptional book Persephone's Children, A Life in Fragments, through that same imprint. So we're in for a really, truly exceptional conversation this evening, which is why I will not take up much of your time. I just have a few quick notes before we get started, and then I'll introduce your host for tonight. Now, the one thing to note is we are particularly pleased that you could all join us here tonight, as the back of the book makes reference to the wintry landscape of Winnipeg. We are instead gifted with a humid and rather ominous evening tonight, so a slight change of pace, but I think it'll still be thematically appropriate. So there'll be a conversation and a series of readings from the chairs to my left, following which there'll be an opportunity for you folks to ask questions if you have any. If you do, and you're physically located here in the store, please just put up your hand and I'll run over to you with a microphone, which is not a comment on your ability to project your voice. It just ensures those watching at home can hear any questions you might have. If you are one of those people watching at home, please just write any questions you might have in the chat and we can put them to Camille as time permits. Following the event, the only thing I will put in your head right now is that there'll be a brief moment where we just bring Camille over to a table located beside our cash desk, where she'll be signing copies of the book. And I guess I won't have more details about signing procedure because you'll be hearing from my co-presenter and good friend Charlene Deal of the Winnipeg International Writers Festival, who will offer a few closing words about the festival. So all I will say is we have plenty of copies of Sweet as Sugar, both at our cash desk and on the signing table. So please do feel free to avail yourself of a copy, and just please do make sure you pay for the book before you physically leave the store. Now, this is an exceptional debut collection of short stories, and we could not be more pleased to be celebrating it here today in Camille's hometown, and so grateful that you could take the time to join us here as well. Your host for the evening is a truly wonderful writer. Rowan McCandless is an award-winning author of fiction and creative nonfiction, and serves as the creative nonfiction editor for The Fiddlehead. She has been longlisted for the Journey Prize, won the Constance Rook Creative Nonfiction Prize, and received gold for one-of-a-kind storytelling at the National Magazine Awards. Her debut book, Persephone's Children, is a huge favorite here at the store. It's an incredibly acclaimed and wonderful multi-genre memoir, and truly one of the more exceptional reading experiences I have had over the last few months. So it's my immense pleasure to welcome Rowan McCandless.
Well, I'm really happy to be here with all of you this evening and to be here with Camille. The first thing I'd like to do is just to read a bit so that you have an idea of what Sweet as Sugar is about, and then we're going to have a reading by Camille, and then we'll take things from there. So, Sweet as Sugar is a testimony to the unseen forces, always vigilant, ever ready, imbuing the characters in this collection with both resilience and trauma. From Winnipeg winterscapes to Toronto's condo culture, from Havana's haunted streets to Trinidad's calamitous environs, the stories in Swedish Sugar are permeated with the violence of colonial histories, personal and intimate, reflecting legacies of abandonment and loss. The veil between the living and the dead is obscured. Chaos becomes panacea, and the characters take drastic measures into their own hands. Survivors of all kinds seek strategy and solace. A group of homeless people organize an occupation of vacant condos. A new resident to a disturbing neighborhood tries to make sense of madness. A dog investigates the sudden disappearance of his owner. The 5 intertwined vignettes in the title story are set in a Caribbean country where the specter of the sugar plantation haunts everyone. Tying this collection together is the casual brutality of our everyday lives, whether seen through the eyes of animal, spirit, or human being. And now I'd like to introduce Camille. So honored to do this. Before we begin, I'd like to introduce Camille Hernández-Ramdwar. Camille is an author, scholar, and independent consultant. Her debut collection of short stories, Swedish Sugar, was published by Rare Machines Dundurn Press in 2023. Her earlier work appeared in Whispers from the Cotton Tree Root, Caribbean Fabulist Fiction, Invisible Cities Press 2000, Mercury Retrograde Sister Vision Press in 1999, and But Where Are You Really From? Stories of Identity and Assimilation in Canada, Sister Vision Press 1997. Camille is an Associate Professor Emerita. Thank you. At Toronto's Metropolitan University, where for over 20 years, she engaged in teaching, writing, research, and activism concerning anti-racism and Caribbean studies in Canada. Camille is currently working on a book about the failures of anti-racism initiatives in Canadian universities, as well as a novel of historical fiction and magical realism spanning multiple continents and eras. Well, I can't wait for that one. She divides her time between Toronto and Trinidad, where she and her husband run a small dog rescue. Everyone, this is Camille, and she's going to start us off with a short read.
Good evening, everyone. In preparing for tonight, Rowan and I had a couple of conversations, and Rowan, one of the first things she said to me was, "I'm so glad that you wrote in Caribbean Creole." She was just so happy about that, and I felt so happy to hear that. And so, in honor of that conversation, I am going to jump in and read from the story called How to Build a Sadist. I'll just set it up a little bit. This story is written in Trinidad Creole. And the character in the story, this is a very common story. There's nothing unusual about this young man's story. So I'm going to jump in there. And like Rowan said, if you want to understand it, you will. And this How to Build a Sadist goes through different steps. So I'm going to jump in with step 7. The false god kept all the boys on the block paid. It was he running the drugs game while posing off as the savior of the poor. If you do my bidding, is money. Pray 5 times a day. Learn to read the Quran. Wear a mukla, go to Juma. This haram, that haram. Marvin fell in, then out of the rituals. Fawcett felt good, but having to pray before going robbing and killing just didn't make sense. Sadist didn't know which set of bandits to fall in with. The false god had plenty rules. But the party was just that. Party time! Now that he was old enough to vote, the campaigners took a new interest in E. Election season, he could both eat her food and fed. Party! The music truck, ramen roti sharing. Party! The party campaign soca songs to put you in a trance with the spiritual Baptist rhythms. Endless. Party! Carefully choreographed dance moves. Coquille brooms to sweep away all the evilness in the land. And red panty, big bottom woman. Party! Marvin was young, but he was not dumb. He took the campaign t-shirts with the money tucked inside, signed up for the ghost work gangs, and collected several checks under multiple names every fortnight. But he saw through all the lies and the mama guy. Survival. Politicians and them didn't come from where he came from. They didn't know what it was to have to walk up and down a steep hill for your whole life, to have no current and no water, to bathe in standpipe, to face empty cupboards and an empty fridge. Saddest sidestepped the cult of the party, evaded the thumb of the false god. There were no leaders. Step 8. Before he went on work, Marvin used to fast and pray. He used to push himself to the point of anger at all those who had it easy in life. All those who felt because they had it easy in life somehow meant they were better than he. The ones who watch he cut eye, the gals who squeeze up themselves, passing here on the pavement, or bunch up themselves, small, in the back seat of a taxi. The bank workers and shop girls, afraid to touch him, scrunching up their face as if they smelling shit. He would starve himself until he anger and he hunger burned together, until he had no heart. And it was easy to pull a gun on someone and stick it in their jaw or rest it against their forehead and watch they shit themselves while he goes around for 2 pockets, drawers, cupboards, purses. The first time Marvin hold a gun in his hand, he was 9. He liked the weight and the coolness of it. And by 15, it and weed were best friends.
Loved it so much. So now we're going to get into Q&A discussion with one another. And the first question that I have is, titles matter. So why did you select Swedish Sugar as your title?
The sugar refers to the sugar plantation, which is the history of the Caribbean. A whole lot of people were thrown together because of sugar, and sugar is still a big part of who we are. I mean, it's literally shaped our genetics. For example, we have very high rates of diabetes because of this history of sugar. But what was happening with me was I kept hearing snippets of stories in my head, just like ideas for stories. And they went through different eras in time. And then I thought, well, why don't I just put these little stories together into a suite, right? If you notice, the title is not sweet like how sugar tastes, but a suite, like a suite of music. And so I did it chronologically. And as I was thinking this through, I thought, here's our history, how sugar brought us to the Caribbean, how sugar keeps showing up in these different unpleasant ways.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so many of the problems that we're dealing with in the Caribbean, like childhood obesity or like diabetes, which I mentioned, or a lot of health problems, and also the poverty and the economics. You know, I mean, sugar, 500 years of sugar in the Caribbean really destroyed the soil, for one, and the fact that the entire economy was built around sugar. And then when sugar crashed in the 1850s and then again in the early 20th century, and you know, the colonizers pulled out, and then it was like, you guys are on your own, you know, with depleted soil, and there was never any investment in any of these colonies. It was just about producing sugar. So we have this legacy.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
So I was wondering if you could describe your process in writing Sweet as Sugar.
I have to say, I'm not a process, like, I can't really answer the process question. I know that's the, writers are often asked, what's your process? I have a lot of ideas in my head. I think a lot about things, and I know that some people have said, oh, this is grim, you write a lot of grim stuff, or, but that's what I think about. I think about injustice. I think a lot about the legacies of colonialism. I think a lot about the fact that there's still so much suffering that isn't being addressed, or people aren't aware of it, and these kind of things. And so from that usually becomes the impetus for a story. Or it sometimes, the inspiration comes from a news article or a conversation or something. And then, the story just kind of comes from that. But in terms of a process, I've kind of been saying this in some of the interviews I've been doing, but I do hear voices in my head. I'm not crazy. I hear voices in my head. I hear, to me, it's ancestors speaking to me, or it's spirits that are speaking to me, or whatever. And I'll hear a line, I'll hear a voice, I'll hear a conversation, I'll hear something. And then I'm like, yeah, that could be a story.
Mm-hmm. It's always striking to me how our ancestors kind of lift us up and help us write these tales, so that these stories that are so important are shared and heard. Absolutely. And understood by other people.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, this question is a good segue. Both of our books speak to language and colonialism. For me, there are languages lost on both sides of my family. And how to make a sayist, you made use of Trinidadian Creole to tell the story. Was that important to you, and why?
Yeah, Creole shows up in some of the other stories in the book. But that particular story, because the character, Marvin, in this story, that is his language, and that is the language of his world. So there was really no other way for me at least, that you could tell this story without doing it justice, unless you're putting it in the language of the actual people who are living this very rough existence. And I'll just, speak a bit about Trinidad here. Trinidad right now is the 6th most violent country, or most homicidal country on the planet. We're having an epidemic of violent crime and murders and so on. It reached, just as an example, it was over, I think, 605 murders last year in a country of 1.5 million. So murders are an everyday occurrence, 5 to 6 a day. They're happening around the clock. They're not just happening in particular areas, they're happening all over the place. So yeah, and there's so many young men, and this story is it's a lot about masculinity. And so there's a story about a young man. So many young men are absolutely caught up in that, and they don't live long. Their days are quite numbered. And so again, that is another legacy of colonialism and the plantation and so on, that we have this kind of a crisis going on now.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much for that, Camille. This is one of my favorite stories. The first story in your collection is entitled It's Lit, and deals with themes such as gentrification, homelessness, and housing insecurity. Housing insecurity was a topic that I wrote about in Persephone's Children, and I was wondering, why did you choose these themes as points of exploration in your book?
Well, I've lived in Toronto, I think it's definitely over 30 years. And so I've watched the place, the cost of housing in Toronto just skyrocket. And I raised 2 kids there. And, my kids also felt the impact of gentrification. One is still in Toronto, but one left because the cost of living just became unbearable. So that has, really been close to our lives, the impact of that. And I also was around when I saw a change of government, and it's mentioned here in that story particularly, when the Mike Harris government came into power in Ontario in the 1990s. You suddenly saw homeless people everywhere that you didn't see before. So this was a big change. that a lot of people, he cut welfare. One of the first things he did was cut welfare by 22%. So you saw this immediate impact in a society that you're living in. And now, my kids and I would both agree with this, like Toronto is kind of unrecognizable to us. It is nothing like what it used to be. It has become a city for the rich. Housing is completely unaffordable, and there's more and more people on the street. There's more and more people in precarious living situations, and there's more and more giant multi-million-dollar condos going up all the time, just all the time. And I lived, right? So from 2015 to 2022, I lived in the neighborhoods that are mentioned in that story. So I was witnessing it firsthand, and I was an insider outsider, because I was kind of like, I didn't really belong in there, right? I managed to find housing there, pretty affordable housing, but I was kind of reminded on a daily basis that somehow I didn't really belong. So for example, I might go to the elevator, waiting at the elevator, and in Trinidad, you always greet people, good morning, good afternoon, so I'd be standing at the elevator with somebody, and this happened more than, like, I'm not saying it's one, many times this happened. You say good morning to somebody and nothing, no response, right? Not even look at me. And I thought, do they think I'm the cleaner? Because I look like the cleaner, I look like the cleaners in the building, or I look like the concierge in the building. And I got along great with those people. But my actual neighbors did not even see me, right? So right there, it was laid bare. Yeah. Right? The class differences were really pronounced.
And they certainly are written so in the story. It's lit, which is, as I said before, one of my favorites. So amongst many favorites.
Thank you.
In my book, Persephone's Children, I made use of different structural forms to tell my story. In The Death of Caravana, you make use of a Zoom call structure. How did this form come about for you? And which came first, form or content?
Content for sure. So this story, Death of Caravana, well, just a bit of background. I was a professor of Caribbean studies for about 30 years. So obviously Caravana was a big topic in the classroom. So for years, and I was kind of an archivist of Caravana materials, and I watched over the years how students' perception of Caravana changed, the way that they talked about their own experiences of it, my own experiences of it. So I had so many conversations and all this material in my head, and like that story couldn't even begin to do it justice. This will probably end up as a book about Caravana, which, by the way, there is none, which is quite interesting when you think about it. A Canadian institution that's over 50 years old now. Why is there no book? And it was the pandemic, so we were all on Zoom calls. And I thought, well, maybe this is a way I can kind of introduce these topics by having this Zoom call with these different characters, and every one of the characters can be representing one of these perspectives that so many people, like that doesn't even, it scratches the surface, but there's a lot more perspectives. But I thought, let me just have these few characters here with their own perspectives and representations of Caravana, and kind of, get the conversation started. And I've actually had a really positive response to that story, with a lot of people said, I've had these conversations for years, or, like, wow, but it was so great to read it in a story and to read it on the page, because we all are kind of living it. Yeah. Or even when there's discussion, in Betty Tapia, one of the characters is reminiscing, and everyone's like, yeah, everybody has memories, especially in Toronto, right? Caribbean people, especially, everybody has memories of Caravana, and yet we have no documentation of it.
It's always interesting just whose history is remembered and whose history is ignored.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Speaking of short stories, did you find some of them were easier to write than others? And move my paper. And conversely, which proved the most difficult to write?
Probably Swedish Sugar was easiest to write because for whatever reason, the voices in those stories just spoke to me. Like they kind of wrote themselves. Like it was just, this has to come out, you know, and there it was. I don't know if I can really, maybe Death of Caravana was a bit harder to write. Maybe because that was the first time I'd written something in that form of a Zoom call where you literally have these very distinct voices in this call. And I wrote it in different font and I'm so grateful for Dundurn for doing this great job of like, okay, we're gonna make sure every voice has its own font so people will also get this, right? And so that was a little bit challenging, kind of fun too.
Yeah, I love those hybrid forms.
So maybe I'll do more of it, but I don't think anything was really hard, just, you know, oh, this is new, right? So how do I do this? Okay, I'll try this.
They did an excellent job.
Thank you.
With that Zoom call structure. So both of our books also speak to domestic abuse and misogyny. And when I read Van Lane, I really connected with that story because the woman's lack of voice to speak to her boyfriend's testosterone-laden driving and her fear of getting into an accident, that this is the way life is and most likely will be. I felt her fear and her impotence to change things. Why did you choose to write this particular story? And how does it connect with other stories in your collection?
I think the constant presence of fear and violence is what connects it to the other stories. So, I mean, this is based on a real road in Trinidad, that story, right? And it blows my mind every time I'm on that road because I'm always wondering, just for people who don't know, maybe haven't read it, it's a 3-lane road, kind of a major road in Trinidad, a major artery, I guess. And so there's 2 roads, one goes 3 lanes. So 1 lane is always going west, 1 lane is always going east, and then you have this crazy middle road that changes direction in the middle of the day. So there's signs up that will say 9 to 2 p.m. going into town. So that's for commuters, right? And then 2 p.m. to 5 or 9 or whatever it is, you're going east. But my take on that is Trinidadians don't follow rules. So why would you bother to put these signs? Some people will follow the rules, but you know, it's always like, well, boy, I could overtake this person, boy, and I ain't a rush on it. I really had to take this road right now, boy, and I really care. And so you get these people, and sometimes they're in big, you know, what we call pickups here, they call vans in Trinidad, big Hilux and these kind of things. And they're just barreling down that middle lane and they don't care. It's like, you move, because I'm not moving. And my truck is bigger than yours. So it becomes this game of chicken kind of going on. And I've seen so many near accidents happen on that road. And yet somehow there hasn't really been that many accidents. So all of this, I mean, it's terrifying, but it's also fascinating for me, probably as a sociologist. I'm like, what's really going on in this place? And then I just started to kind of follow that thought. Okay, so we're living in a country that's in a crisis of violence. People are being killed, people are losing loved ones. What is going on here, right? And then I started to follow that thought with the story.
Many of your stories mention the spirit world, which was something I really appreciated. Was it by happenstance or conscious decision to incorporate spirit world elements?
It's conscious decision. It's part of my reality. So therefore, it would be present in the stories. It's not like oh, maybe I'll do this. This is interesting. It's normal to me to have that in there. And then in certain stories, I took it further where I made it the topic of the story, right? Like these are the main characters, the dead, you know? So yeah, and I think I kind of wanted to maybe by doing that, normalize it. not necessarily for Caribbean people, because honestly, Caribbean people already write like that. And there's some amazing authors out right now who are publishing, and they're doing really well out there in the literary world, and I'm so happy for them. But we tend to write about this stuff like it is normal, because that is kind of the way it is in the Caribbean. People just accept the fact that there's spirits around.
Yeah.
But I like the idea of kind of putting it out for other audiences and making them main characters of stories, and it's nothing weird in it, you know.
Yeah.
It's just like, yeah, you know, that could really happen. That it maybe is happening right now.
Yeah, just that connection to the spirit world and what it opens up and offers can be, you know, really potent in storytelling. And not only seeing it as storytelling, but also as being a part of heritage.
Yes, absolutely.
That it's, as you say, considered normal, because that's just a part of culture. That's a part of the spiritual fabric of the Caribbean. And also, I think for many, speaking for myself as a Black biracial woman, I know that the spirit world is very important to me, and making use of it is seen as a way that it's not something that's out of the ordinary, but it is a part of our lives.
Yes, and the ancestors, like what your sister says, specifically when you're talking about heritage, that in many of our cultures, you respect the ancestors, and they're not considered gone, you know, far away, removed. They're right here. They're just part of the family.
Yeah. What are some of the takeaways from your short story collection that you hope readers will connect with?
I mean, you know, I did this as an academic for years, but I'm really probably preoccupied or concerned with the questions of injustice. And as someone who was an educator for so many years, it always blew my mind that so many of my students just didn't know basic history, right? So I'm always trying to, and I'm happy to see that that's changing. One of the things that I certainly noted was when I started teaching, you know, sociology or even Caribbean studies, I would go in and ask the students, rooms of 100 students or so, who's heard of residential schools? And maybe one or two hands would go up, right? And that was back in the early 2000s. And now, if you ask that question, everybody's hand is going up. So that's a huge change, right? So I think it's, I want readers to, those of them that aren't familiar with this, to learn a little bit about these legacies, for example. I think more and more Canadians are becoming aware of the legacy of colonialism in relation to Indigenous people in Canada, but I'm also now bringing in this Caribbean connection. And, you know, it's not explicitly in this book, but Canada played a very important role in the colonization of the Caribbean. I think a lot of Canadians don't realize, for example, that we have Royal Bank of Canada in the Caribbean, we have Scotiabank in the Caribbean, and they've been there since the 19th century, right? Yeah, Royal Bank has, you know, so hey, like this is not, you know, we're not removed at all. And then let's not even get into Haiti and Canada's role in, you know, the current situation in Haiti, and then Haiti's amazing history that isn't taught in schools, you know, an incredible history. So it's just like a little drop in the bucket here, but maybe it will have some people thinking, yeah, I want to know more. You know,
those conversations.
Yeah, opens conversations for sure. Yeah.
So I'm wondering, both for myself and for the audience, what projects are you working on now that you'd like to share with us? Yeah, so I mean, you mentioned in your intro, so there's the nonfiction book that I'm working on about the failures of anti-racism in Canadian universities, which I know very well, right? But let's talk about the fiction, because yeah, I think that's where my heart's really set right now. So I'm in the early writing and research stages of a historical novel that is covering 5 centuries and 3 continents. And it again has to do with this
interest in colonialism, and I'm fascinated by the way in which colonialism and globalization brings people together from such disparate parts of the world. How did these people come together? What could these people possibly have in common? Oh, colonialism, right? And there's so many stories there. So it's a bit of a challenge, but I think I'm up to it. I'm super excited about it. I want to find a way to connect all of these stories across time and place and bring it all together, and for people to really see, oh my gosh, this is so, mind-blowing, because it really is when you think about it. Now we have internet, and you can talk to people in other parts of the world, and there was before those times, people were still connecting and getting together and interacting and, having children and all kinds of stuff. So I really want to talk about that.
That sounds excellent. I'm looking forward to what you are going to be bringing out next. And I'm sure there'll be quite a few books to follow. So now we're very fortunate because we're going to have another reading by Camille.
Okay. Okay, I think I'm going to read from Sweet as Sugar. And I'm going to start at the very beginning of the sweetness of lies. The Arcadia had promised them so much. It was such a long time ago that Old Ma and Old Pa, cane cutters at Brechin Castle Estate in Caroni, could not even remember all the lies he had lied to them. When they arrived in Trinidad, they were sent to the plantation and the hard work began. The swinging, slashing, and chopping. Hot sun, rain, blisters on hands, swinging, slashing, chopping, dust choking, muscles aching, your wielding arm feel like it would come out of its socket, the cutlass feeling like it was now part of your anatomy. Slashing, chopping, cutting. Then the beatings, the threats. A wooden, rotting row dwelling with no privacy and no air. They later learned the Creole people had lived there before them under slavery. The soot and smoke of cooking fires, and overseer's eyes passing over Ma's backside too much, and Pa looking to kill. And the cane, the endless cane that went on for miles, undulating in the breeze, then at once mocking you on the tepid, breezeless days of the dry season. Days that burned into your skin and your eyes and made you feel to dead. During the rainy season, the canes hid all kinds of dangers. Hookworms, snakes, scorpions, even the tiny day mosquitoes that were relentless. At first, Ma had wondered how long they would have to stay in this place, if there was any way out of this indentureship contract they had unwittingly put their thumbprints to, if they would really be able to get back on a ship and return to India, rich and whole, ready for a better life, as the Arcadia had intimated after this nightmare was over. But now, as she looked out at the dark, vast sea of cane, black now, silhouetted by the pale blue and marine twilight sky, the majestic silver clouds, after a long day of being swallowed up in those same fields, and after sharing out the modest evening meal for Pa and herself, Ma knew they would never cross that Kalapani, the Black Sea, again. They were here now. They had to make a life of it. Long before Old Ma and Old Pa and thousands of others like them arrived in Trinidad, a French Creole named Saint-Hilaire Begarat brought the succulent, fortuitous yellow sugar cane to the isle and set himself up as lord amongst his African slaves. For kicks, he would hold court in a limestone cave overlooking the Diego Martin Valley, and like a pharaoh, insist they compose kaisos, bragging about what a demon he was, what a terror, what an evil satanic entity. His slaves knew this to be true, knew that for any insurrection, they would be tortured or even killed in these same caves, hot red blood splashing on white walls, an indelible stain. Begarat promised them freedom if they sang his praises. He promised he would leave something for them after he died, land, ring, a gold coin. The same people who hewed the forests of Diego Martin, who uprooted rocks and stumps, who broke up hard land to make it cultivatable, who planted the sweet, sweet cane to enrich Begarat. in the end were freed by the Slave Emancipation Act, and not by any crazed French Creole. So, as free human beings, they left his sugar plantation, knowing there was no sweetness in the lie. There was nothing to be had there, not with that Beelzebub and his megalomania.
Thank you so much for that, Camille. John, can I get a time?
Of course, it's just 7:45.
Oh, okay, we're doing well. So now we're going to take a few minutes to do audience Q&A. So if you have any questions, now's the time.
And if you happen to be watching online, feel free to just write any questions you might have into the chat as well. Yes.
I'm just curious, like from your first story about when this degree of violence started in Trinidad. Like I was in there in 1987. I taught a summer course in St. Vincent, and then from Union Island flew to Trinidad for a few days before coming back. I didn't see anything suggesting any of that. The only couple of things I remember is there were currency controls at that time, which would indicate some, economic difficulty and hardship. And I think also it's maybe after some sort of oil boom or something. But were things bad back then too? Do you know, or was it much after that?
Yeah. Oh, it was a dream compared to now back then, because oil was flowing, the standard of living was the highest in the Caribbean.
Yeah.
People were thriving. The only thing was that cocaine was now starting to come into the country. So you were seeing the effects both in society, that people were becoming addicts, but you were beginning to see the effects of the cocaine trade in the 80s, just starting, and then it just went haywire. Because Trinidad is a major transshipment point for cocaine. The cocaine is not produced in Trinidad, it's produced in South America and Colombia, Bolivia, Peru, and so on. And then it's shipped through Trinidad to the global north. And it's devastated Trinidad. It's devastated, it devastated Jamaica first. So Jamaica in the 1980s, that was the forewarning for what was going to happen to every country pretty much, with the exception of Cuba in the region.
Yeah, like I also taught a course in Bahamas in '84, and that was a big point with the planes coming in and then the boats dashing over to Florida. I think now it's coming through Mexico, is it, or is it still coming through?
It's still coming through China, and it's worse now because it's not just cocaine, it's guns and it's human trafficking. So we have three things going on, and not just us, right? But everyone kind of in that region. So the level of arms, the gangsters have much more dangerous guns than the police or the army, and they're using them whenever they feel like it. And everybody, as they say, everybody in that society has their hands in the drug trade and the army, the whole contraband, right? So politicians, business people, customs officers, everybody's touched by it. If it is not already, it's on the verge of being a narco state.
So we do have a question online as well. So Rose asks, the theme of spirituality as a modality or resilience and resistance runs deep in this collection. Imbuing is a particular standout for me in that regard. Can you speak about the rich history of spirituality as the backbone of resistance?
Oh, lovely question. Sure, I could go talk about that all night, right? Well, I mean, specifically as a person of Caribbean heritage, among many heritages, but of Caribbean heritage, our history is one of resistance, those of us who were colonized. And so spirituality is what kept us alive, right? So even though Christianity is the #1 religion in the region, there are so many different other faiths that survived colonialism. sometimes whether people had to hide it, but it was a way of maintaining community, and it was a way of maintaining connection to the ancestors, and it was a way of maintaining ritual, right? Sometimes like magical ritual as a way of surviving the horrors of slavery, surviving the horrors of indentureship, surviving the genocide that happened to Indigenous people, and then after the end of slavery and indentureship, just the conditions that people were left to live in. So it's been incredibly important as a form of resistance. And even, I would say, even Christianity, which was the colonizers' religion, people in the Caribbean still use Christianity even as a form of resistance because of the forms. It's very similar to the African American churches, right? Christianity, they use Christianity in a particular kind of way so that it is liberating, so that it is to fight against oppression, So it's very, very much tied in. The way that we use spirituality and religion in the Caribbean is very much tied into this history of resistance and survival.
Were there any other questions from the audience? Yes.
I love that you read in Creole. It's gorgeous to listen to. And so I'm just wondering if you talk a little bit about, your relationship here in Winnipeg, and you lived in Toronto for a long time. So what is your current, what is your experience of Trinidad? How did you get there? And, how do you have that voice so fresh in your ear?
Yeah. It's Trinidad has been so important to me, even as a child living here. It was because I didn't feel I belonged here. That was really, and I'm kind of blown away that this is the longest I think I've spent in Winnipeg, probably since I left in the 80s. And I'm just blown away because I'm spending some time, in a restaurants and whatever, at how diverse it's become. And I'm so grateful. And I'm thinking, well, maybe if it was like this when I was growing up here, I wouldn't have just wanted to get out so bad, because I did. It was hard growing up here. And so when I did finally get to Trinidad, it just felt like home, and it still feels like home. So in fact, I'm a dual citizen. I have a home in each country. I'm back and forth all the time. But yeah, I really feel like that's pretty much where I belong, even though it's nice to come to this home. I'm kind of retracing my steps of, where I grew up and so on. It's like I'm able to appreciate what Winnipeg did for me, and how it shaped me. And it's still, especially in the summer. In the summer, it's so beautiful, right? It could be like this all the time. But there's something special about this place too. So, but yeah, absolutely. Trinidad has been very, very important to me.
How about your kids?
Not so much. Yeah, they're Canadian. Even though I was born here, right? But they were born here too. But yeah, they're definitely more settled here, for sure. Yeah.
I was going to build on that question a little bit and selfishly ask you as well. Like just here in Canada, we have so much to thank Trinidad and Tobago for, and from a literary sense as well, some of the exceptional writers here in the country that have come from that area. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to not only your influences within the Caribbean tradition, but also what you see happening now among the writing community there too.
It's incredible what's happening. And I'll just extend it to the Caribbean, but I could go on, brag about Trinidad and Tobago writers. In April, I was at Boca's Lit Fest, which is the biggest Caribbean literary festival. And I've been to it before, but I was actually on a panel this time, so I was thrilled. And it's just amazing the amount of talent that's coming out right now. One of the very big names is Kevin Jared Hossain, who's written a book called Hungry Ghosts, and it's just making waves all over the place. Ayana Lloyd Banwo, who wrote When We Were Birds, a stunning book, very spiritual, very, again, the normalization of ghosts, the whole book is just about the dead, and it's incredible, beautifully written. Lisa Allen Agostini, who was so kind to endorse my book, wrote a book called The Bread the Devil Need, about domestic violence. Again, an incredible book. And she wrote it in Creole. She wrote the entire novel. in Creole, but I would say a very accessible Creole. But she was, you know, no, we got to stay true to the voice because it's written in the first person. So many others. Pleasant View by Celeste Mohammed. These are just stunning writers, and there's just been this wave in the last few years of them coming out, and I'm kind of feeling really excited that I'm kind of, you know, out there with them. But yeah, if you haven't read these authors, please go look for them because they're just incredible. So I'm not sure what's happening right now, like why this is happening, but I think there's also maybe, I mean, they wouldn't be out there unless publishers were willing to say, hey, we want you out there, you know, we're going to give you a voice. Maybe there was writers like this all the time and they just weren't getting the access to the publishing. That's possible. But thank God this is happening. And they're winning awards, you know, like The Bread the Devil Need was shortlisted for the Women's Prize last year. I'm expecting Hungry Ghost is going to go big, you know, really big. But yeah, there's like a whole renaissance happening right now. I'd say Caribbean writing for sure.
Fantastic, thank you so much.
It's great.
We are just approaching the top of the hour, but are there any final questions? And if not, I can turn things over to our host and our guest of honor for any final comments they might have, and then we'll call Charlene up from the Writers' Festival to close this down.
I just want to say how honored I was to be asked to be the host for your launch. Swedish Sugar is a very special book, and you're a very special person. And it was just, I felt a kinship, and yeah, just thank you so much for allowing me to be part of this, and to Ben and also McNally Robinson. I know that you would like a moment to say a few thank yous as well, so I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Rowan. I feel the same from the time we started speaking, for sure. Yes, I do want to say my thank yous. First, the team at Dundurn. Thank you, Dundurn, so much for going with this. I want to thank Alison Isaac, who was the first person to read the manuscript and said, no, you know, I'm pushing this forward. The editors that worked on the book, Julie Manel, Aaron Pinkson, Susan Fitzgerald, thank you so much for the great, wonderful job you did. Laura Boyle for this amazing cover that she did in a one-off. Kendra Martin, Sales and Marketing Manager, Maria Zupardi, Marketing Coordinator and Community Manager, thank you. Rajdeep Singh, my publicist, thank you, Rajdeep, for all the work that you've done. And Kwame Scott Fraser, who's the president of Dundurn, and Catherine Lane, Associate Publisher, thank you. Again, I want to thank McNally Robinson for this event. Thank you so much. It's so nice to come back to Winnipeg and be able to actually launch my book here, and also to Thin Air Winnipeg. Thank you so much. Rowan, thank you very much for being the host tonight. I'm sure we're going to have many more conversations, many more conversations. And I also want to thank the endorsers, as I said, who were so kind to endorse my book in its very infancy. Ramabai Espene, who is again another amazing Trinidadian author based in Toronto. She wrote The Swinging Bridge. Lisa Allen Agostini, who I mentioned, and Ifiona Fulani, again, a wonderful author who's Jamaican, British, American. My friends and family, my sister who's here tonight, and partner Jerome and Brenda, thank you so much for coming tonight. And the other attendees, thank you so much. And I hope my husband might be watching, so I love you, Jason, he's in Trinidad, and all of our dogs. And finally, last but not least, the ancestors in their Risha, thank you, Mother Kwe.
John adjusted this mic, so it'll be just the right height. Thank you all for coming tonight. What a beautiful, exciting, uplifting conversation. Thank you both, Camille and Rowan, for bringing your open hearts to a conversation and to inviting us to hear some stories that some of us might not encounter and some of us might be living in. So it seems to me that the stories are so core to how we understand who we are. And I love that the city is becoming more diverse, but also that our national Canadian literature is itself also becoming so much more diverse and offering us so many more angles on what is it to be alive, and also how colonialism is affecting all of us, regardless of where our people come from and how we have invented the culture that we live in. So thank you for the openings today and the ideas you planted in our minds. And thank you also for sharing those beautiful voices. It just, you could come home with me if you'd like to. I would like that very much. Thank you all for coming tonight. It's a hot day to be out, but it's cool and beautiful here. And it's so important that we have a chance to gather in a place like this, where the stories are everywhere, in the air, on the shelves, and in our interactions with one another. A huge thanks to McNally for making us welcome and providing this kind of home for us for so many years, and being a core place for us to gather. So I'd also especially like to thank John, who keeps popping out in his Wizard of Oz role back here. He's really amazing at this. So would you please thank McNally and and so the last step here is that Camille will head over to sign books by the cash desk. So if you can just let her get over there before you come and talk to her, but please do stop and have a look at the book, get it signed. They do it weird here, but you have to pay for the book before you leave the store. Thank you for coming tonight. We have one more event in our spring series, which is Sharon Butala, and if my memory serves, it's June 15th that she's here, but I'll wait for the Wizard of Oz to say if I'm right.
You are correct.
I remembered. So maybe we'll see you back here in a couple of weeks to meet with Sharon. Thank you so much for coming. One more big round of applause. It was really amazing.